If occupation is wrong in eastern Ukraine, it must be wrong in the West Bank. If siege and cutting off electricity, water supplies is wrong in Ukraine, it must be wrong in Gaza. If not, our part of the world look like industrial hypocrisy producers.
Hello and welcome to the Fourcast, another of our editions focusing on events on Israel and Gaza. I'm Krishnan Guru-Murthy, and joining me for this programme is Jan Egeland. Now, Jan is a Norwegian diplomat and a humanitarian leader. He is Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council and a former UN Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. We've spoken to him on Channel 4 News for many years about many different conflicts, but most recently, of course, about events in the Middle East. And his particular expertise in this area comes from his history as the lead diplomat in the Oslo Accords, when Israel and the Palestinians perhaps came there closest to a lasting peace. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
The language around describing this conflict always has to sort of deal in a sort of on the one hand and on the other, and a sort of equivalence. You know, you talk about the terribleness of the October 7th attacks by Hamas, but you also talk about the right-wing extreme position, as you see it, of the Israeli government. I mean, they're not equal, are they? There is not an equivalence. You know, where do you feel the balance lies now?
No, I mean, the one equivalence is that you can't speak 2 minutes with an average Israeli or an average Palestinian before this great sense of we're not understood, our situation is not understood, comes forward. So I would just also say it's very exhausting to try to be an intermediary here, because there is people talk about the centuries, the generations of injustice, of being persecuted, of not being recognized, etc. But then no, there is no equivalence in the sense that on the one side you have an occupier, on the other side you have people being occupied. On one side you have a well-organized state institutions, a free press, democratic elections, and the other side it's turmoil, it's injustice, and it's also weak and split leadership. It's a strong party and a weak party. The stronger party is supported by the world superpower. It's not two equal. It's not Germany versus France or Sweden versus Norway. This is a very difficult asymmetrical conflict.
And so, how do you approach the Israeli justification for its actions, which is that it is rooting out Hamas, it is rooting out some of the worst terrorism in the world, that it was the victim of the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. You know, when you hear that position by the Israeli government and all the people who speak for it, what's your reaction when you see what's happening on the ground?
The initial reaction on the 7th of October and on the 8th of October, when it dawned upon us how horrific it was, how widespread it was, how many civilians were killed, then there was this enormous impulse of sympathy, empathy with the Israelis, and of course, I mean, the whole feelings of anti-Semitism and even the Holocaust came up. The great solidarity with Israel that was expressed in so many parts of the world was equal to the one with the United States on the 11th of September. But what came after was a a mistake by Israel, which is like the one in the United States in its war on terror, that you went from having a just cause in fighting terror and fighting massacres inflicted upon your civilians to engaging in some mud wrestling where you lose completely the moral high ground. And of course, we predicted from the first day of the military campaign on Gaza that it would be indiscriminate, it would be gruesome, and it would be counterproductive for the security of Israel. I haven't seen in my many years as a humanitarian worker anywhere where so many people have been so trapped with no escape in such a densely populated area with such an indiscriminate bombardment for so many days. I think that says it all. Not even Aleppo on the Assad Russian bombardment, or Mosul when it was retaken by the Islamic State, etc., had this kind of a bombardment. And remember, there's no escape. There is no Poland for Gazans. There is no Lebanon as there was for the Syrians. There is no place to go.
I mean, the thing is to say that Israel has totally lost the moral high ground is it's a really bold statement, and the one that international governments are not making. Why do you think Europe, the United States, the key players in the United Nations are not saying the kinds of things that you're saying?
Well, many are. I don't know if they say they lost the moral high ground, but I mean, there is now, there was a near unanimous call for an immediate ceasefire and rejection of the Israeli argument that you have to smash the whole place to root out the armed men. You have to basically make it unlivable and smash the homes of the women and children of Gaza. I think it was the United States, Czechia, Micronesia, Nauru. I mean, there wasn't support for this stand anywhere in the world except really the United States, which makes basically the some of the Western positions that was earlier supported by the UK and Germany, less so today, make this their stand on Ukraine also looking very hypocritical. So if occupation is wrong in eastern Ukraine, it must be wrong in the West Bank. If siege and cutting off electricity, water supplies is wrong in Ukraine, it must be wrong in Gaza. If not, our part of the world look like industrial hypocrisy producers.
Have you said that to international diplomats?
Yeah, I have, well, directly and indirectly many times. Of course, my country, Norway, basically agree with this view. I mean, I'm a humanitarian worker. I can say things more bluntly as I see them, but this has been the position of my country, Norway, now for quite some time, including that it's a question of the moral force of the West in Ukraine that is now being undermined by the position of providing arms to this mass killing of children that happens in Gaza. Really, my heart bleeds for the 36 children that were mercilessly killed by the militants, the terrorists that came out of Gaza on the 7th of October. My heart equally bleeds for the 10, 11,000 children that have been killed in Gaza. I mean, it's disproportionate beyond belief, this response. And there are rules in combating terror as there are rules in any armed action in the world.
I mean, in your terms, the world is making a quite extraordinary mistake in its diplomacy and its approach to this whole crisis.
Well, it's not really the world. I mean, look at the South Africa and so on. I mean, who couldn't be more opposed to the support for the military action in Gaza. Look at the support that South Africa is having across Africa and large parts of the world. What we end up is having the West against the rest, as many say, or rather parts of the West against the rest. And I'm very concerned that also our main donors, those countries who usually support international law and the promotion of international law, also now have lost the moral high ground because of their support for this assault on a trapped population in Gaza. Look at how the Gazans have been treated over the last 20 years. Really, it's been one besiegement and collective punishment after the other.
I mean, given what you said, if that is essentially the position of the Norwegian government now, how could you build confidence with the Israeli government to enter into talks? You know, if you now straightforwardly think what they're doing is so wrong, why would they enter into a process with people who think that?
But again, my wording is not that of the Norwegian government. I'm an outspoken advocate for civilians, and I condemn the atrocities against civilians wherever I see them. However, I have also said, as a former lead diplomat in the 1990s for Norwegian diplomacy and bridge building between Palestinians and Israelis, I cannot see the Norwegian government playing that role today, because the Netanyahu government does not regard Norway as in any way as a neutral or impartial actor. It has to be the United States that now takes upon it the role that they should have played for many years and hasn't now. And it has to get, I mean, it's the US with the EU and the UK really telling Israel, you cannot continue with this occupation, with these settlements, with these atrocities, even though you're under attack by armed groups that have not recognized you. You cannot. And equally, Egypt, the Gulf countries, Jordan, Turkey, have to realize that they have to push the Palestinians to unite around a position that recognizes the right of Israel to exist and brings Palestinians to the table as a coherent and rational actor, which they are not at the moment. I think it has to be these international actors that pushes now a peace process, so that we will not continue to see this cycles of violence in the future.
I mean, the trouble is, especially in a US election year, that's just not realistic, is it? I mean, a United States intervention to the extent that you're describing could swing a domestic election and could determine who the US president is. And, you know, that means that we have another year, probably of stalemate.
Although you could start a process, it's difficult. It's very difficult, and the polarization you have between the parties is also there in the international community now. However, the reason we got the Madrid process, as it was called, that led to the Oslo possibility of a Norwegian back channel in the early 1990s was that the first Bush administration basically said, we're not going to send you billions of dollars 1st of January every year to finance your military, Israel. You have to negotiate a peace with your neighbors, and that led to that peace process, and that led to the historic Oslo Agreement, that led to the PLO recognizing Israel's right to exist and Israel accepting a Palestinian administration in first parts of the West Bank, in Gaza and Jericho, and then further on in the West Bank. And then I'm the first to say that the Oslo Agreement was not even half realized. The enemies of peace became too strong, and we failed in bringing the peace we had hoped at the time.
I wonder, if we could go a little bit into that history, first of all, and just explain to us, what were the conditions that brought about the Oslo Accords, and why was it so different to now?
Well, we have to go back to the early 1990s, so this is more than 30 years ago. At that time, the situation was also very desperate. There was full Israeli occupation since 1967 of the West Bank and Gaza. I was in Gaza. It was heavily militarized, so was the West Bank. And the PLO was considered a terrorist organization by Israel, by the United States, by the United Kingdom, by very many Western countries. But everybody knew, even at that time, that it was one of the fundamental conflicts of the Middle East, of the world, really. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict was central to the Israeli-Arab conflict. It created tensions across the world, really. People were committing acts of terror or extremism in the name of solidarity with the oppressed Palestinians and to liberate Jerusalem, as they would say. Now, so we in Norway, I was then the deputy foreign minister, we saw a potential for Norway doing something here that we would call confidence building measures, since we had great relations with Israel, historic relations, and Norway was instrumental in the United Nations in the creation of the State of Israel. The first Secretary General of the UN, Trygve Lie, was a Norwegian. There was great solidarity between the Norwegian Labour Party that I belonged to and the Israeli Labour Party. But little by little, through the 1970s and 80s, Norway had also normalized with the Palestinians and their foremost organization, the PLO. So long story short, when after the 1992 Gulf War, PLO saw that it was broke because they had sided, Yasser Arafat had sided with Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and the Gulf countries cut off funding to them. They came to us and said, we're willing to make a historic compromise with Israel if you could broker contact with them. And we started discreet contacts. And when the Labour Party came back in power with Prime Minister Rabin, Foreign Minister Shimon Peres, the time was ripe, and we could do the famous back channel, the Norwegian channel between the two arch enemies.
I mean, that's a wonderful potted history of what happened. And I wonder whether you think, the situation at the moment offers any kind of similar possibility.
Yeah, I mean, there are some similarities in the sense that there is a complete stalemate, as there was at that time, that PLO was considered a terrorist organization you couldn't touch, like Hamas is considered today by Israelis and most Western powers. The whole bleakness of the situation is very similar. However, I would consider it even worse today. The Palestinians are very split. There is not one Palestinian movement as the PLO was on, they could argue, on behalf of the Palestinians. And Israel has its most right-wing extreme government in its history. And it comes on the backdrop of a cruel terrorist, murderous attack on Israel on the 7th of October that has really led to the worst Palestinian-Israeli war ever. And on top of that, the settlements, the colonization of the West Bank is much worse than it was at that time. There are the adverse factors are even worse now. However, perhaps there is now a realization of the urgency of the situation like never before. I don't think there is any capital which would like to see a repeat every 2 years of conflict and war in the Middle East. So there is also now a searching for solutions like never more, and I expect there to be strong efforts to have a peace initiative when there is a ceasefire in Gaza.
I mean, the trouble is that it brings us back to, you have a right-wing government in Israel being led by Mr. Netanyahu, who shows absolutely no desire to enter into a peace process and wants a military solution to this in the first instance. And you have a relatively weak but long-standing Palestinian Authority, which is not in control of Gaza. So who would be the interlocutors? Who would, for the Palestinian side, who would you be talking to?
Well, on these things, there is always a way. If there is a will, there is a way. I mean, Arafat kept saying, whenever you spoke to him about impossibilities, and so did Rabin and Peres. I think there will be there are many Palestinian leaders that have credibility. Some have both in the West Bank and Gaza, and they are not today's politicians or military leaders or movement leaders. They are Palestinians that are known and have credibility. So that both these are peoples that are incredibly admirable in the amount of talent of articulate leaders they have produced, both Israelis and Palestinians. There must be better leaders than those who are there now, because I mean it's incredible who are now sitting in the Israeli cabinet, and of course many of the Palestinian leaders have been there now without elections for very long.
But who? I mean, in terms I'm trying to understand how it works. I mean, because who determines who the peace brokers are ultimately? You have an Israeli prime minister, you have a Palestinian president, and you have this group Hamas with its leadership. How do you break when you're trying to enter into a process, the kind of which you went? Do you ultimately need them to be the people who decide, yes, okay, it's time to talk? Or can you go around them if they don't want to?
Well, in diplomacy there are a million ways. You can have proximity talks, you can have indirect talks, you can have exploratory talks. You just have to have people who are willing to talk to each other, that have some legitimacy and some possible sway on their respective sides, and then you build up to be more and more representative, etc. Again, I admit, I mean, it was nearly impossible to get any agreement in 1992, 93. We got an agreement. Today, it's much worse. It's much worse for the reasons we have discussed. But the urgency to have agreements is even greater now. 25,000 dead Palestinians. The 1,200 dead Israelis in a day in a small country. I mean, it cannot continue like now. And I think in Israel they will understand by having made Gaza unlivable. It's not going to be more moderate, or all of those who have their relatives killed will not be really understanding to the right of Israel to exist. I mean, it's counterproductive to continue to believe that the military way is the one that will bring lasting peace.
Can I also talk to you about the sort of the other elements of the conflict which has been bubbling over the last couple of weeks, which is what's going on with Yemeni attacks on shipping carried out by the Houthi rebel regime in Yemen. What do you think is going on there, and why is it being done? Because the way it's sort of commonly portrayed is that the Houthis are supplied and supported by the Iranian regime, and that this is some sort of proxy way of agitating internationally. What do you think the strategy is? What's the point of those attacks, and how do you stop them?
Well, it's hard to find a rationality in anything that's happening in the Middle East now. But I would first just observe that, again, back to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is having ripple effects across the Middle East and far beyond. So indeed, in Yemen, the feeling of solidarity with Gaza is enormous, as it is in many other parts of the Middle East. And then the tools chosen are, of course, counterproductive, irrational, and will lead to more conflict. It's not just that one. I mean, we are humanitarian workers where across the Middle East, Norwegian Refugee Council has thousands of field workers in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Lebanon, in the Palestinian territories. And what we're seeing at the moment is conflict being worse all over the place. And it's bound to make a life much worse for the children, for the women, for the civilians in these areas, including in Yemen, where we now see a cycle of violence, response, action, response. Same in Lebanon, same in Iraq. Now even Iran is attacking its neighboring countries. I'm very worried, really. The thought that you can reach political goals by using military means is very, very dangerous and contagious disease.
So do you genuinely fear that there is a real risk of escalation on a rapid and big scale, or is it that this conflict just gradually infects other parts of the Middle East and draws in other countries, whether it's part of southern Lebanon and parts of Syria and parts of Yemen and so on? I mean, is there, I think there's a tendency at the moment now, that this has been going on for many months, for people in the West to say, well, that's just the way things are now. It's not going to blow up. It's going to be a contained conflict. Do you think there's a real danger that it could blow up into a much bigger conflict?
Yes, that's real. I mean, I see three scenarios: the good, the bad, and the ugly. I mean, the good scenario would be that we get the ceasefire in Gaza. We have a release of hostages and arbitrarily arrested Palestinians. We have a start of a broker discussion of how to deal with the underlying reasons for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. That again would lead to an end to the escalation we've seen in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere, that's also a very real positive possibility. And then there is the bad scenario, which is that you see continuous war in Gaza. You see slowly increase in violence from Lebanon, where Hezbollah is big and strong. The warfare from and on Yemen, and in Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere. And then there is the ugly one, is that you basically you get a free fall, and you have a much larger conflict that could also even be triggered by mistakes and misunderstandings and revenge that nobody can control. I think, unfortunately, it's the bad scenario that is now the most likely for quite some time to go. Slowly worsening conflict.
So just to come, I mean, you've made it clear what you think needs to happen and how it needs to happen in terms of the United States' role. Right now, the position of the United States and the British government is not to support or call for an immediate ceasefire. How do you change that as the first step?
Well, listen, I think the UK and the US view has actually changed quite a bit from this initial diplomacy, which was counterproductive, really. They feel whatever Israel wants, we'll give it to you. Whatever you want, do it. That was a green light to enter into Gaza with the military machine, and the thought that you could just crush all militancy without crushing a large civilian community. That was a mistake, I think, really, by Washington, by London, by Germany, and by others. This has changed a lot. I mean, there is no doubt that the US and the UK is working for a ceasefire that would start with sustained pauses. They are working for generalized humanitarian access to Gaza, which we do not have. There hasn't been one day for the last 110 days of war where we've had humanitarian access that is remotely what we need. The best day was, I believe, around the 30th of November, with 300 of the 500-600 needed trucks. Even now, it's around 200 trucks. So every day we accumulate more needs that will lead to a famine. The US, the UK, Germany, and others cannot even deliver that, which is amazing in the impotence of that diplomacy. However, the positions have changed, and I think it will build towards the allies of Israel being much tougher with Israel. That is, relying on international support for its military.
Are you hopeful that this will happen?
I think it is gradually happening. Just as I think there is this feeling on the Arab side that there has to become a Palestinian side that you can talk to, and a leadership that is dynamic and is coherent. So yes, I think things can and will happen that could lead to this positive scenario that we just discussed.
Jan Egeland, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.